At just 20 years old, Clara Vance found herself completely homeless, shivering beneath the bitter autumn wind that swept through the high mountain pass of Blackwood Junction. It was the ruthless town banker, Thaddeus Sterling, who had cast her out onto the gravel streets, seizing her family's homestead under the guise of a manufactured debt just weeks after her father's sudden passing. With nothing left to her name but a single silver pocket watch and exactly $4 in crumpled bills, she did what the locals called an act of pure madness. She handed those final $4 to a sympathetic rail yard hand for the deed to a rusted, derelict wooden railroad car that sat forgotten on a dead-end spur behind the livery. To the townsfolk, it was a foolish, desperate attempt to find shelter in a piece of scrap metal destined for the furnace. Yet, they did not know that beneath the rotted, iron-rimmed planks of that abandoned car lay a sealed false floor, hiding a secret that would not only change Clara's life forever, but rewrite the destiny of the entire valley. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Clara Vance. If you are watching from a quiet place today, perhaps feeling a bit forgotten or overlooked by the world around you, please tell us your story in the comments below. To truly understand the strength that resided within Clara Vance, one must understand the Valley of Blackwood Junction as it existed in the final decade of the 19th century, a place where the mountains rose like jagged teeth against the sky, and the pine trees smelled of sweet resin and cold rain. Clara had been raised by her father, Silas Vance, a master carpenter and a man whose hands were permanently stained with the dark walnut stain of his trade and calloused by decades of honest labor. Silas was a quiet soul, but he possessed a deep, unshakable reverence for the world he built with his tools, a philosophy he passed down to his daughter during the long, amber-lit afternoons in his workshop. He would often hold up a piece of rough-hewn timber, discarded by the local logging mills as knotted or warped, and show Clara how, with a steady hand and a sharp draw-knife, the most beautiful grains could be coaxed from the deep interior of the wood. He taught her to listen to the language of structures, to understand how a well-joined mortise and tenon could bear the weight of a roof through a century of winter blizzards, and how true value was rarely found on the polished surface of things, but rather hidden deep within their bones. Clara grew up not with the fine silks or porcelain dolls of the town's wealthier merchants, but with the weight of a brass framing square in her hands and the knowledge of how to read the rings of a felled cedar like pages in a history book. She possessed an innate resourcefulness, a sharp, analytical mind that could calculate the pitch of a roof or the load-bearing capacity of a timber frame just by looking at it, and a dignity that could not be shaken by the simple poverty of their lives. They lived on the eastern edge of the junction, where the tracks of the grand locomotive lines cut through the rock, their small cabin surrounded by elderberry bushes and the constant rhythmic thrum of the passing trains. Silas had helped build the very station that anchored the town, infusing the grand waiting room with hand-carved corbels and sturdy white oak benches that welcomed travelers from across the continent. He believed that even a transit station, a place where people merely passed through, deserved the care and respect of a cathedral, because to him, every traveler deserved a moment of dignity. It was this education in patience, craftsmanship, and quiet observation that shaped Clara into a young woman who did not look at the world with desperation, but with a deep, discerning eye, searching always for the hidden integrity beneath the rough exterior of a harsh frontier. The winter of 1892 arrived with a cruel, sudden violence, bringing with it a frost that seeped deep into the earth, and a misfortune that would unravel Clara's world in a matter of weeks. Silas Vance caught a heavy, rattling chill in his chest while repairing the roof of the town livery during a freezing sleet storm, an illness that no amount of pine needle tea or hot poultices could break. As her father lay bedridden, his breathing growing shallow and faint like the rustle of dry leaves, Thaddeus Sterling, the president of the Blackwood Junction Commercial Bank, began to circle their small homestead like a hawk over a wounded field mouse. Sterling was a man who measured human worth strictly in ledgers and compound interest, a speculator who had arrived from the East with pockets full of capital and a heart devoid of empathy. He had long coveted the fertile, timber-rich acreage that Silas had homesteaded decades prior, a parcel of land that had grown immensely valuable as the railway expanded its regional yards. While Clara focused all her energy on nursing her failing father, Sterling produced a document, a predatory loan agreement that he claimed Silas had signed years ago to fund his workshop equipment, complete with an exorbitant interest rate that had quietly compounded in the dark. Silas, too weak to speak or defend his name, passed away on a Tuesday morning just as the first snow began to fall, leaving Clara alone in a world that suddenly felt vast, cold, and entirely indifferent. Before the earth over her father's grave could even freeze solid, Sterling arrived at the cabin door, accompanied by the county sheriff, presenting an eviction notice and demanding immediate payment of a debt that Clara knew, deep in her heart, her meticulous father would never have legally incurred. With no money to hire a lawyer and no family to stand between her and the banker's greed, Clara was forced to watch as the sheriff padlocked the door to her childhood home, leaving her standing on the frozen road with nothing but the clothes on her back, a small leather satchel containing her father's old silver pocket watch, and a meager handful of coins totaling exactly $4. The townsfolk, fearful of Sterling's immense financial influence and desperate to protect their own fragile positions, looked away as she walked past, closing their curtains and pulling their coats tighter against the biting wind. Driven by a sheer instinct for survival and a refusal to beg for charity from a town that had turned its back on her, Clara walked down into the low, smoky hollow of the railway yards, where the discarded remnants of the Iron Age were left to die. The rail yard was a graveyard of twisted metal, broken ties, and obsolete machinery, a stark contrast to the bustling, prosperous Main Street just 3 blocks away. It was here that she spotted it, an old, derelict wooden boxcar, designated as number 412, sitting isolated on a short, disconnected spur of track that ran directly against a steep shale cliff behind the livery. The car was a pitiful sight, its dark red paint long since blistered away by decades of sun and mountain frost, its heavy iron wheels partially sunken into the gravel and weeds, and its wooden siding covered in a thick patina of orange rust and soot. It had been built in the early 1870s, a relic of an older era of railroading, abandoned by the company because its wooden frame could no longer withstand the immense strain of the modern, heavy coal trains. To anyone else, it was nothing more than a dangerous eyesore, a giant splintering coffin of rotted pine and rusted iron brackets that the yardmaster intended to burn for scrap when the spring thaw arrived. But as Clara approached the car, her father's teachings echoed in her mind, and she did not see a piece of junk. She saw a structure that was still standing straight, its heavy timber sills remarkably unbowed by the weight of time. its iron roof panels still shielding the interior from the falling snow. She found Barney, an aging, silver-haired yard hand who had known her father and whose heart had not yet been hardened by the town's cold commercial spirit. She placed her remaining $4 into his calloused palm, asking for the bill of sale for the abandoned car, a transaction that Barney agreed to with a mixture of profound pity and bewilderment, shaking his head as he signed the company scrip that legally transferred ownership of the derelict boxcar to the 20-year-old orphan. The first evening in her new home was a testament to Clara's unyielding resilience as she climbed through the heavy, rusted sliding door of the boxcar with a borrowed broom, a single kerosene lantern, and a spirit that refused to break. The interior of the car was freezing, smelling heavily of damp earth, old grease, and the faint, sweet scent of grain that had been hauled across the prairies decades ago. As she swept away the cobwebs, the mouse nests, and the accumulated grime of 20 years of neglect, her boots made a peculiar, hollow sound against the floorboards, a sound that immediately caught the attention of her finely tuned carpenter's ear. She knelt down in the dim golden glow of the lantern, brushing away a thick layer of coal dust from the floorboards, and began to examine the construction of the car with the methodical precision her father had taught her. She noticed that the floor was constructed of thick, double-layered planks of old-growth yellow pine, but as she measured the interior height of the car against the exterior dimensions, using a piece of string, she realized there was an inexplicable discrepancy of nearly 6 inches. A standard boxcar of this era had a single floor laid directly over the iron underframe, yet this particular car possessed an elevated platform that seemed entirely unnecessary for the transport of ordinary freight. Her curiosity thoroughly aroused, Clara fetched her father's old iron pry bar from her satchel and carefully inserted the flat edge between 2 of the wide floorboards near the dark rear corner of the car, farthest from the sliding door. With a firm, steady pressure, she leaned her weight into the tool, expecting the wood to groan and splinter with rot, but instead, the plank lifted smoothly, revealing that the heavy iron square-headed spikes holding it down were not rusted into the wood, but had been meticulously coated in tallow to allow for their easy removal. As the first plank came free, she peered into the narrow, dark cavity beneath, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized she had not just broken into a structural subfloor, but had uncovered a deliberately engineered, perfectly concealed false floor that spanned the entire length and width of the train car. The space beneath the planks was not empty, nor was it filled with the debris of the rail yard. Instead, it contained a series of shallow, zinc-lined compartments, completely airtight and perfectly preserved from the damp mountain air. In the first compartment, Clara found a heavy, oilcloth-wrapped bundle, which she carefully lifted onto the upper floor, her hands trembling slightly as she untied the thick hemp twine that secured it. When she peeled back the protective layers of waterproof cloth, she did not find a hoard of gold coin or sparkling jewelry, but something far more valuable and dangerous, a collection of leather-bound ledgers, official railway manifests from the year 1877, and a thick stack of original, unrecorded land deeds bearing the embossed seal of the United States Territory of Colorado. As she opened the primary ledger, the elegant Spencerian handwriting of a long-dead railway auditor revealed a secret that turned the history of Blackwood Junction completely on its head. The documents detailed a massive, systematic land fraud scheme orchestrated 20 years earlier by a young, ambitious clerk named Thaddeus Sterling, who had embezzled the savings of the town's original homesteaders and railway labourers, using forged foreclosure notices to steal their lands before the official government titles could be recorded in the regional capital. The boxcar, it turned out, had belonged to an independent railway paymaster who had discovered Sterling's immense crime and had hidden the definitive proof, along with the true, uncorrupted land deeds, within this false floor, just days before he mysteriously vanished from the territory, leaving the car to sit forgotten on the dead spur as the town grew up around it. Clara sat in the silence of the boxcar for hours, the lantern light flickering against the walls, as she realized that nearly every family in Blackwood Junction was currently paying rent or mortgage interest to Thaddeus Sterling for land that they actually owned free and clear, their true titles preserved right beneath her feet in a $4 piece of junk. The realization of what she held in her hands brought a profound sense of responsibility to Clara, an understanding that her own personal hardship was intimately connected to the systemic injustice that had gripped the entire community for 2 decades. She spent the next 3 days secretly studying the documents, cross-referencing the old territorial plot maps with the current layout of the town, discovering that her father's own homestead had been rightfully purchased by her grandfather from the government, and that Sterling's claim of a historic debt was an absolute fabrication. The stakes rose dramatically on the 4th morning, when Thaddeus Sterling himself rode down into the rail yard, accompanied by 2 of his hired land agents, having discovered that the daughter of Silas Vance had taken up residence in the abandoned car behind the livery. Sterling stood outside the sliding door, his expensive wool coat dusted with snow, his face a mask of cold condescension, as he informed Clara that the land on which the dead spur sat had just been purchased by his bank, and that she had 24 hours to vacate the property before the boxcar was broken up for firewood and she was arrested for vagrancy. He looked at her with a cruel, satisfied smile, believing he had finally broken the spirit of the Vance family, entirely unaware that the young woman looking down at him from the doorway was holding the key to his absolute ruin in her jacket pocket. Clara did not flinch, nor did she raise her voice. Instead, she looked the banker directly in the eye with a calm, dignified resolve that caused him to shift uncomfortably in his leather saddle, her voice steady as she informed him that she would leave the property when the law required it, and not a moment sooner. The moment Sterling rode away, Clara knew she had to act quickly, before the banker realized what was hidden inside the car and used his immense power to destroy the evidence and silence her forever. Instead of taking the documents to the local sheriff, who she knew was firmly under the banker's financial thumb, Clara utilized the very network that Sterling had spent his life exploiting, the ordinary, working-class people of Blackwood Junction. That evening, under the cover of a heavy mountain snowfall, she quietly visited the homes of the town's most respected but struggling citizens, the blacksmith, the widowed baker, the veteran rail yard hands, and the simple farmers who lived on the margins of the valley. She invited them all to a secret meeting inside the spacious interior of boxcar number 412, promising to show them something that concerned the survival of their families and the future of their town. By midnight, more than 30 people were crammed into the dark, insulated warmth of the wooden car, their breath visible in the air as Clara stood before them, lifted the secret floor planks, and displayed the original territorial deeds and the embezzlement ledgers. The crowd fell into a stunned, emotional silence as the blacksmith held the lantern over a deed bearing his own father's signature, realizing that the heavy interest payments that had kept his family in poverty for a generation were completely illegal, and that his shop belonged to him entirely. Clara explained her plan, a strategy rooted not in violent rebellion or personal greed, but in the meticulous application of justice. They would use the morning train to send a trusted courier directly to the Federal Circuit Court in Denver, delivering the uncorrupted documents directly to a federal judge who was beyond the reach of Sterling's local bribes. The townspeople, inspired by Clara's courage and her willingness to share this life-changing discovery rather than using it to enrich herself, united behind her, forming a human shield around the old boxcar to protect it through the night from any sudden actions by the banker's men. The climax of the struggle arrived the following noon, when Thaddeus Sterling returned to the rail yard with a crew of laborers carrying axes and crowbars, determined to forcibly demolish the boxcar and evict Clara from the valley once and for all. But as the banker approached the dead spur, he found his path completely blocked by a solid, silent wall of over 100 townspeople, their faces grim and resolute, standing shoulder to shoulder in the freezing mud around boxcar number 412. Before Sterling could command his men to advance, a steam whistle wailed in the distance, and a special passenger coach rolled into the station, carrying a United States Marshal and a Federal Circuit prosecutor who had been dispatched immediately upon receiving the undeniable proof of the territorial land fraud. The marshal stepped off the platform and walked directly into the rail yard, presenting Sterling with a federal warrant for his immediate arrest on charges of grand larceny, forgery, and land piracy against the citizens of the United States. The banker's face drained of color, turning a sickly, ash-gray as he realized that his empire of paper and intimidation had collapsed in an instant, undone not by a rival financier, but by a 20-year-old girl and a rusted railroad car that he had dismissed as worthless scrap. As Sterling was led away in iron handcuffs, his head bowed against the jeers of the crowd, the townspeople turned to Clara, their eyes filled with a profound gratitude for the young woman who had endured the absolute worst of misfortunes, only to bring about the redemption of their entire community. Months later, as the green grass of spring began to reclaim the mountain valley, Blackwood Junction had transformed into a place of genuine prosperity and hope, its citizens finally free from the crushing weight of fraudulent debts and secure in the ownership of their ancestral lands. Clara Vance did not use her newfound influence to build a grand mansion or live a life of idle luxury. Instead, she used her portion of her restored family estate to purchase the dead spur and the surrounding land, turning boxcar number 412 into the town's first public library and historical archive. She left the false floor partially open, covered by a sheet of thick, polished glass, so that every child in the valley could look down and see the place where the true foundation of their community had been preserved during its darkest hour. Whenever we walk past that old, beautifully restored red train car, its wood now oiled and gleaming beneath the mountain sun, we are reminded of the young woman who refused to let her value be defined by her circumstances. We remember how a homeless orphan of 20 years old took her final $4 and found a treasure of justice that a wealthy banker could never purchase with all his gold. Settle in, and let us always remember the story of Clara Vance, a woman who proved that the most broken, overlooked things in this life often hold the secrets that can heal the world. Thank you so much for spending your valuable time with us in the high valley of Blackwood Junction today. And if this story brought a bit of warmth to your heart, we kindly invite you to share it with someone who might need a reminder of their own inner strength. Before you go, we would love to leave you with one reflective question to consider. What is a time in your own life when you found immense value or a beautiful truth in something that others had completely written off as worthless junk? Your thoughts and stories mean the world to us, and we read every single one of them. Until next time, stay close.